This is a sermon that you have often maybe heard preachers say that sometimes when they preach, they're really preaching to themselves. And my experience is not that that's always the case. There are definitely sermons that I write because of needs of the congregation. But I will say this is the sermon that I needed this week, Psalm 127. I hope it'll be of benefit to you as well. But I found myself thinking about this passage a lot. My wife has been quoting a verse from this passage to the children every night for the last 3 weeks, probably at least. We've all had crazy years, and we've had a crazy year just like everybody else. And I found myself wanting to get back on track with life, wanting to get in regular routines, wanting to feel like things are normal, like I know what's going to be around the corner. And maybe you felt that way as well. This psalm, if you look at the beginning of Psalm 127, there's a psalm heading, and it says, a song of ascents. I won't go into all the detail about this, but a song of ascent is traditionally understood as being the songs that were sung by God's people on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. When they would go to Jerusalem for the annual feast, they would sing these songs in anticipation of being in God's city again, being in God's temple again, and praising and glorifying God. And so you can imagine the process in the ancient world of getting your family together to make a pilgrimage like this. You don't just get tickets and go on a plane and show up the next day and then you're back before you know it. This is a big thing. And as you get everything together, you might be thinking about all of the stuff you have been working on, all the projects you've been building, the houses that you were building, the fields that you were working on, and how you're just going to pack up and you're just going to leave that all behind to go and worship the Lord. You might be thinking about making the trek with your family. Are we going to be safe? Will there be robbers along the way? Will we be able to have the food and water we need as we make the journey? Are my children going to behave enough, or is everybody going to kill each other before we get there? You might be thinking about what you're building. You might be thinking about your family. You might be thinking about what happens when you get there and when you get home. As we gather for worship this morning, and as we are pressing on toward heavenly Jerusalem, heavenly Zion, we may also be wondering about the course of our life, about the things that we leave behind, about our homes. In general, the uncertain times may make us wonder about what we're building, and are we even building anything, and what is even going on, and are our families going to make it? And so Psalm 127 is a helpful psalm for those of us who are pilgrims, those of us who are sojourning through difficult times, who are thinking about our families, who are thinking about our projects, heading toward the worship of God. Let's start with Psalm 127, verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat. The basic point of these first two verses is that apart from the Lord, everything you do, everything you build, every project you set yourself to will be pointless. It's pointless at every step of it. If you labor to build it, you're going to build it, he says, in vain. If you then somehow manage to build it, you're going to watch over it, protecting it, hoping that it'll be okay, and that too will be in vain. And if you are able to build it and watch over it, and it still stands and you get to enjoy a moment, you'll find that even while you eat, you're eating the bread of anxious toil. And even what you've done and even what you've protected will be vain. At the literal level, this is true. You can't build a house without God. God supplies the timber, God supplies the energy, God supplies the laws of the universe that makes anything work. You literally can't build a house apart from God. You also can't protect a city apart from God. You can build and put walls and you can do everything you want to do. And even in our modern world, even very recently, how much do we read about how unstable our cities are? A hurricane can come And we can watch and we can warn and we can do everything we can to protect, and yet levees still break and cities still flood and lives are still lost and homes are destroyed. We do not have the power to build and to protect our cities and our homes. Anything we set to do apart from the Lord will be in vain. And even if God in His providence allows us to build and watch over it, if you aren't building the Lord's building, if your work is not a part of the Lord's building up of His house, you might be able to enjoy it for a little while, and yet you'll still find yourself looking over your city and wondering, what is this really for? Why did we build all of this? Is there any true and lasting value to what I've set my life to do? I've woken up early. I've stayed up late. I've worried and I've worked and I've worried and I've worked. But what have I really accomplished? There's a vanity to what we do. Do you ever feel that way? That you work and you work and you work, and then a pandemic hits? I mean, I think about the people who have small businesses who spent their whole life taking a risk to live their dream. And then they lose their business in a time like this. And how pointless everything you did would feel, knowing that there are things way beyond your control that you couldn't help. But that's the way life typically is. It's full of frustration and worry. And if we're building our own house, that will be what it is in the end. If we're building our own things, our own church, our own homes, our own businesses, our own missions, they will be pointless in the end. They will be vain. And if we get a taste of the feeling that it's all pointless right now, that's a gift. It's a gift because it's God telling you before the end, you're wasting your life. You're wasting your energy. You're trying to build something different than what God is building. He wants you to focus on peace and on love and on self-sacrifice, and you're just trying to build a nice retirement or have more gadgets for your kids or just whatever your own dream is. I think a lot about how in the Midwest, especially in the small town Midwest, we have this thing called rugged individualism. It's often understood as a virtue in our culture. This idea of picking yourself up by your own bootstraps, of being diligent, of being self-sufficient. I think that's something that's not just true of our city. I think it's true of a lot of us here in this church. We don't want to have anybody else's help. We don't want to need anybody else's help. We don't want to bother anybody or burden anybody. We want to be able to do it on our own. But we can't do it on our own. Unless the Lord builds the house, it's all in vain. And if you're trying to raise your family through your own effort, if you're trying to build up this church through your own effort, if you're trying to serve your career and your neighbors and your community and your country through your own efforts, it will be in vain. If you think it really comes down to you, if everything rests on your shoulders, then in the end, you're going to find yourself putting your work before God. You're going to end up putting your wisdom before God's wisdom. You're going to put faith in yourself before you put faith in God. You won't have time to pray. You won't have time to sit at God's word and listen and meditate. You won't take the risk of doing what God says when you can't see how it will pay off for your family or for your business or for your church. And you'll find that everything you did, because you did it your way, on your own, will come to ruin. Think about the man who wrote this psalm, at least according to the heading. It says, a song of ascents of Solomon. One of the ironies of the Bible is so many of the things that rugged individualists who say, you got to work hard and raise your family good, and you just got to follow this wisdom. One of the ironies is the passages that we use. The passages we use to create this picture of just work hard and you'll have a good family and a good community and a good job. One of the ironies is that the very texts we use are from a man who ruined his family, who ruined his city, who ruined his country. Solomon, the man who wrote so many great proverbs about wives and children, had tons of wives. Wives that he either ruined or that led him astray. He built great projects, but he put his faith in them so much so that he stopped trusting in God like he should. And by the end of his life, all the peace and prosperity that God gave him started to go away. Enemies raised up in the time of peace and threatened Israel. The kingdom that was whole under Solomon was torn apart from Solomon, and Solomon's son Rehoboam led the nation into deep idolatry and sin. Because even if you have cute little wisdoms, even the wisdoms of Scripture, but you think it's mainly your efforts, or you start doing things your way, the house will come to ruin. Only God builds the house. And so as you think about your family, as you think about your home, as you think about this church, as you think about your private endeavors, I want you to ask yourself, am I joining what God is building in all of these things? Or am I doing my own thing? Am I trusting in God's power and God's wisdom? Or am I trusting in my wisdom and in my power? If we try to build anything apart from God, it will come to ruin and it will be in vain. The last part of verse 2 is the part that my wife has been citing to each of my children. This is how we say goodnight to each other. She said, it says in Psalm 127, the translation is different than what we do. The NIV says, "For he grants sleep to those he loves." The way my wife says it is from the ESV. He gives to his beloved, and then the kids say, sleep. The Lord gives to his beloved sleep. The people who build their own thing, they build in vain. They watch in vain. They get up early and they stay up late. And even while they're eating, they're worried and they're anxious. But the Lord gives to his beloved sleep. He gives sleep to those he loves. What is this saying? It's a great comfort, and it's a great contrast to those who build and who watch and who get up early and who stay up late and who worry even while they're eating. These people sleep. There's great wisdom in sleep. There's great lessons to be learned in sleep. If the Lord is building the house, that means I can sleep. If I'm building the house, maybe I can't sleep. Or maybe I got to find the exact right amount of sleep to not be too tired to do all the work I got to do. I got to find that exact perfect balance. But the Lord's beloved, they sleep. Because they know he builds the house. Parenting, building a family is too big a job for anybody. I've been asking for prayers on our Wednesday study for our family the last few weeks. I just told Jim on the phone last night that if my family has ever needed prayers, we need them now. We have set ourselves on a course that is very obviously too much for us, and we struggle to figure out how to navigate it. But the truth is, that was true before these 3 weeks. And that's true for every family here, whether you have 7 children or 2 children or no children. If you're single and all your home is you, your home is too much for you. And the work is too big for you. But thankfully, for God's people, it's the Lord who does the work. It's the Lord who does the work. Parenting and raising a family and setting your home to be part of God's mission is an important job. And it's a responsibility to be taken seriously. And we need to be good stewards. And we need to work hard. God gives us eternal beings to be in charge of for a few years. But as much as we want to emphasize our responsibility, as much as we want to emphasize how careful we must be and how wise we must be, we need to always remember that we are not the ones who are building this thing. God builds the house, and God gives to his beloved sleep. If you find that you can't sleep, Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to cast a judgment on people who have insomnia or anxiety disorders or depression, so please don't misunderstand this point. But if you find that you can't sleep, it is worth asking why. And I've had trouble sleeping the last several weeks. And what I find is when I'm lying awake, I'm thinking about how I can fix things. I'm thinking about, what am I going to do tomorrow? What are we going to do in the next few years? What's it going to look like 5 years from now? And I'm thinking about the rest of my life in the middle of 3 a.m. and I'm thinking, how am I going to do this? But why am I doing that? Maybe you found yourself in times of special testing or when you set yourself to a hard work, you find yourself up at night thinking about what you did wrong or what you can do better or all of the stuff that you need to do. What is that worrying doing for you? When you lie awake afraid of what might happen tomorrow or a few months from now, what is that actually doing for your family? What is that doing for your spirit? What is that doing for your church or for your community? God gives to his beloved sleep. There's this inspirational quote I was introduced to that, like some inspirational quotes that we make, are really actually terrifying if you think about them too much. This is one that you might see around Mother's Day. It said, God couldn't be everywhere, so he created mothers. That's cute, I guess. Horrifying if true. The last thing I need to tell my wife is, God's busy with some other things. You're on your own, honey. He's left this corner of the universe to you. Yikes. I understand what the quote's trying to say, but thankfully it's not true. God is everywhere, and God is almighty, and God is all-knowing, and even when mothers sleep, God is still God. And even when mothers are worn out, God is still God. And when you are working and you're toiling and you're laboring and you don't have anything anymore, God is still God. And you can sleep. And if you can't sleep and you're lying awake and it's leaving you threadbare because you didn't sleep, God is still God. And he is building your home whether you're awake or whether you're asleep. If you are in Christ and if you are trusting his plan. I said there are great lessons in sleep because sleep teaches us that we aren't in control and that it doesn't come down to just us. Think about how much of your life you are essentially dead. You're just laying there and you're not planning and you're not working and you're not doing anything. And yet the universe still runs. And your children's bodies are still growing even while you're sleeping. And the world continues under God's care. And the sparrows are fed and the grass grows because God is still God. Thank God that he gives to his beloved sleep. And thank God that sleep teaches us that it doesn't all come down to us. Now, the next thing that God gives might seem like one of these Bible contradictions. This passage says, the Lord gives to his beloved sleep, and the next verses are going to tell us that God gives to his beloved children, which as far as I could tell, those don't go together very well. You either have sleep or you have children is what it feels like sometimes. But this passage says God gives to his beloved sleep, and he gives to his beloved children. Verse 3. Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their opponents in the court. Now, this is one of those proverbs or wisdom psalms, I should say, that is more obviously true in the time that it was written. When the Psalms were written, people lived in agrarian cultures, farming communities. And in a farming community, it's more obvious that more children are helpful than fewer children. More children in a farming society means more people who can milk the cows and thresh the grain and pull weeds and do whatever it is that needs to be done. You have more children, you have more farm hands. Some of you know that. In our modern world, especially the more urban modern world, people have less and less children, fewer and fewer children. Why? Because part of the reason is in that kind of world, children are not as obviously a blessing. We got to find a babysitter. We got to put them in daycare. What school are we going to put them in? I have to go to this other meeting. I've got a call with the boss. I need to do some overtime. There's all of these things that call you to embrace your career and this urban life, and children get in the way of that. Pretty much universally, the more urbanized a place, the fewer children that people are having. And so I find myself wrestling sometimes, is this one of those things that's only true in an agricultural world? Maybe it doesn't ring true anymore. Maybe it was only true in its time. And yet, because of where we're going with this, I don't really even think this is about literally, physically having children. I think there's a principle here that is true for those who are building as part of God's project. I don't think this is talking about farming or living in the city at all. That's the metaphor it uses. That's the world that you can understand as an ancient person when you get this psalm. But I don't even think that's really what God's talking about. The work of God's people is not farming or technology and writing programs. The work of God's people of all times and everywhere is to bless the nations. And I do believe it is true that children are a gift in blessing the nations. That children raised by God's power and God's wisdom, taught the ways of the Lord, will help you be a blessing to your neighbors. They will help you bless your community. They will help you be a light in a dark place. And so if you're someone who has children and you do not believe that your children have been helpful in being a blessing to those around you, it might be, and I say might because this is wisdom literature, and wisdom literature has exceptions. It's not always true. It's generally true in a perfect world. But it might be because you have not been building your family as part of the Lord's project. If you've not been teaching your children spiritual values like self-control, then your children will not be very helpful in being a blessing to your neighbors. If you've taught your children to be whiny little brats who can't control their emotions and can't control their appetites, then you'll constantly be exasperated and frustrated and embarrassed by what your children do when you're around other people. And they won't necessarily help you be a blessing. But if you are building the Lord's house and you're bringing your children up with the love and consistency and wisdom of God, then you will have children who, as they grow, become more self-controlled and more patient and more others-minded. And you will find that there are things you could not do to bless your neighbors were it not for your children. And here I would like to tell you lots of specific stories about the last year or so of my family. But I can't right now because I don't want to do that to my children. Some time way down the road when my children are adults and I can ask them permission to tell these stories, I will. But I'll just say that there have been difficult times in our last couple of years. But I have found that this passage is true. Something I read this week in preparation for the psalm really captured what our experience has been. Derek Kidner said, "It is not untypical of God's gifts that first they are liabilities, or at least responsibilities, before they become obvious assets. The greater their promise, the more likely that these sons will be a handful before they are quiverful." What he's saying is God says it's a blessing to have lots of children. They're like a weapon. They're like a tool that helps you accomplish your mission. He says, but that doesn't necessarily mean it starts that way. It may not feel like your children are helping you at first. When the child is crying and hungry at 3 a.m. as an infant, it's not obvious how they're helping you bless your neighbors. Or when a child comes from a traumatic experience and they're processing their trauma, It may not be obvious how that's helping you bless your neighbors. But as children grow and mature, and as we show them love and grace and mercy and long-suffering, our experience has been that not only do our children survive, but they end up helping us. They end up helping us with other children. They end up helping us with some of the children in our neighborhood who are not being raised by Christian parents, and they help us bless others. And maybe that has been your experience as well. Maybe some of you have found that some of the most difficult children have turned out to be some of the greatest blessings that your family brings to others. Because the Lord builds the house, and even though it often starts difficult, it ends in blessing. The Lord gives to his beloved sleep, and the Lord gives to his beloved children. Now, the final thing I want to say is that this really isn't about me and my children, or you and your children, or you and your grandchildren. Really, this passage is about, like all passages, Christ and the church. So I've applied it to my family and to families in general, because that's obviously the first thing I think of when I read it, especially in the last few weeks. And I think that's the initial application. But all the Psalms ultimately are not about our individual families. Ultimately, they are about Christ's family. We, including my family, will never perfectly carry out these passages. And even though I can tell you lots of stories where my children have been blessings, I could tell you lots of stories where they have not been blessings as well. And I can tell you stories where I have not been a blessing to them. In fact, as I mentioned, the man who wrote this psalm ruined his family. Christians and God's people do not always actually live out the promise of these passages. And again, were the world left just to Christian parents, it would all be vain. The good news is that the true son of David, not Solomon, but Jesus, is building God's house. He is building a Christian family. And this family is made up of people who seem to do pretty good living out passages like this. God's family is also made up of people who have destroyed their homes. God's family is made up of people who were given children and they turned those children into monsters. And they ruined their lives. And maybe their children don't even speak to them. And yet, God shows up to those people in grace and says, even though you ruined your family, I will make you part of my family by grace. God makes up his family of people who are single. God makes up his family of people who experience same-sex attraction and who, for that reason, find it difficult to have a traditional family, and some of whom who choose to be celibate. And some of those people, God makes part of his family. God's family is built of single people, celibate people, married people, people with lots of children, people with good children, people with bad children. God is taking our mess that we've made of this world, and he's building up his family and his home. And we do what we can in God's house. But it's ultimately God who builds this house. I don't just think about myself and my children as I read the psalm. I've thought about, I should have got permission to call out people's names, but I'll just say I've been thinking about Jim and Sandy. Bob and Joe were extraordinarily competent men. I often told people that even in his diminished state, Joe is more competent than many of the men in this country. And all of the stuff that Bob and Joe did has, for the most part, fallen on Jim and Sandy. And I don't know that I always tell them or say to the congregation how much we appreciate what you all are doing. I imagine it is exhausting at times and confusing at times, and stuff that they handled that are things you haven't done before. I'm sure that there have been times, perhaps, in here I don't know, but times where you've worried and times where you've been exhausted. I think about others in this church who are doing things that I don't always know about. I appreciate the work that Pat does in getting all the books organized and taping off the pews and all of the different things. That we have people here who are the only Christian in their homes. And they're working day and night and praying to teach their children and to teach their grandchildren and to teach their spouses the better way. And it's exhausting, and it's not always obvious that it's paying off. We have people in this church who are trying to join God's building project. And you may be looking sometimes and feeling like, where is this headed? And it may keep you up at night because you don't see the fruit, or you don't know how you're going to handle the future. I want you to remember that God builds the house. God builds the house. And if we were doing this on our own, it would all be vain. But if we are trusting in God and we are walking in His kingdom, then God will see the work through. And that means God gives to His beloved sleep. I hope that Jim and Sandy, you can have sleep, knowing that God can do what you cannot do. I hope Pat and Jody and everybody here, as you labor to serve, that you can sleep, knowing that God will see this through. And even when we can't see around the corner, and even when we don't understand how things will go, God will complete His work. It is His house, and He will finish the job. Now, in real life, we may not always get a full night's sleep. But as I said, this is ultimately about Christ. And I want to read, I think this is the last passage I want to read with you, and that's Mark chapter 4. There's a detail in this story that's kind of funny, and it really fits with what we just read. Mark chapter 4, verse 36. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling with water. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Now, when you remember this story, do you remember the word cushion or pillow there? That word is there in the Bible. There's a storm raging on, and there's water filling the boat, and not only is Jesus asleep, he's asleep on a pillow. It's probably a ballast that helps the boat. Is that the right word? I don't even know. That, like a bag of sand type deal. But he's on a cushion. He's just chilling while the storm rages on, and the disciples are wondering if they're even going to survive. Why? Because the Lord gives to His beloved sleep, even in the middle of a storm, when others think that this is all going to end in death. Our Lord is building a house, and the one set in charge of that house is Jesus Christ. And Jesus, when He walked this earth, slept. Why? Because He knew who controls the wind and the waves. He knew the one who can see the family of God through the storm. He knew the one who would build a kingdom not only that will survive the storm that boat was in, but that will survive disciples like Peter and John who are afraid the whole thing's going to end because it's windy outside. God knows, Jesus knew, that Peter, who's afraid right now, will become a rock in the church that sees it through times of great persecution. Jesus can sleep because He knows God is building this thing, and God will see him through. And so we can sleep because we know Jesus can sleep. Not only did Jesus sleep, Jesus was able to lay down His life. Remember I said it's like we were dead when we're sleeping? The same Jesus who slept on a cushion in a boat and could do that because He knew God was in control is also the Jesus who could hang on a cross and know that even though I'm being crucified by Roman soldiers right now, the greatest and most enduring and global and eternal kingdom is going to rise from this cross. How? How could He believe that a kingdom could be built from a cross? Because He knows that even as His body slept in the tomb, God would raise Him from the dead and would raise up a kingdom in His glory. The Lord gives to His beloved sleep. So if you're here and you've been struggling with this year, maybe you've been struggling with things that we don't even know about in the rest of the church, burdens that you've been carrying, and it's made you feel like it's all pointless, or you feel exhausted, the first thing you need to do is take stock. What is it that I'm worried about? Am I worried because I've been trusting myself? Or have I been trusting God? Ask yourself, what is it that I'm building? Where's my family headed? Where is my church headed? Maybe we were doing our own thing, and now we're finally realizing it's pointless. But if you see that you are part of the Lord's building, and if you are trusting in Him, sleep. And even if you don't sleep, well, know that King Jesus is building this house. And He will see this work through. A quote that I've written in my journal that I look at is the last thing I want to leave you with. It's from Tim Keller. This is talking about ministers, but ministry is just a word for service. And this is about any of the service you do as well. He says, you can do this ministry with God's help. So give it all you got. You can't do this ministry without God's help. So be at peace.